All right, so we've been going through the 7 railroads, and we're finishing the Burlington Northern Santa Fe right now. And we went through the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Burlington, Spokane, Portland, Seattle, and then in 1970, the Burlington Northern merged. Which remember the history. Jim Hill tried to do it in 1900, and then it got undone by by Teddy Roosevelt. But then, so they did merge in 1970 finally. And then the Frisco was added in 1980. And we'll go through we were looking at the component railroads in 1950, because that was halfway through the century. And it was before they really started doing all the mergers for the next 50 years. So we'll look at each of them. Just quickly, the Burlington, it always advertised itself as this is route miles. They also advertised themselves as everywhere west, 11,000 miles. And then the Great Northern was a little bit smaller, and Northern Pacific's a little bit smaller than that, because they were always much more conservative than the Great Northern, and because they went bankrupt 3 times. And the Frisco, I was surprised. It was pretty good sized. It was about half as big as the Great Northern and the Burlington. And it made it, Burlington had 17,000 million ton miles. And a ton mile, again, is you haul 1 ton, 1 mile. That's a ton mile. And the Frisco is about half that big. Now, in terms of locomotives, all the railroads were about halfway to dieselization in 1950 in terms of ton miles hauled, because yes, it took several diesels to haul what one steam engine did, but the diesels were, as we talked about, much more reliable. The steam engine would get to the end of the line, and they'd take it to the shop and dump the ash and maybe clean the flues and do all sorts of lubrication. The diesel gets to the end of the line, they check the oil, fill it up with fuel and water, and away she goes. Now, in 1970, the Burlington Northern was the Great Northern up here, from basically from Minneapolis and Duluth to Seattle. The Northern Pacific also went Minneapolis and Duluth to Seattle, but they went through the center of North Dakota and Montana, because it was built first before the Great Northern. And then the Burlington had, their main line was to Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then to Denver. And then they had this line to Billings, which we talked about was a nice secondary line. But after the Powder River coal was discovered, they became huge. And then they had the C&S going down to Texas, and then the Fort Worth and Denver went all the way to Galveston. But if we see in the Burlington Northern, there's this big hole in the middle. And so here's the Frisco. Basically, the Frisco was the main lines were a big X from St. Louis to Tulsa down to Fort Worth, and then from Kansas City down to Birmingham and Pensacola, Florida. So it's a big X, and Springfield was the shops and the main yard and everything, classification yard and everything. Well, if you take the Burlington Northern and superimpose the map of the Frisco,
wow,
you see, boy, it fits like a glove.
wow. Huh.
It's definitely not end to end, and it really fit very well. So the approval was relatively easy for a merger. It certainly wasn't end to end.
Well, didn't that happen after the Mopac merger with the UP? I think Mopac into the UP, I think that happened first.
It could be. It was in about the same time. It was in the 80s as well. So
yeah.
But yeah, so that certainly paved the way for it. So it fit the Burlington Northern very well. So we'll look at the history of the Frisco, and it started in this area of here's St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield. So it started in this area. It was a division of the Pacific Railroad, which was started in Franklin, Missouri, which they changed the name to Pacific. And so that was the beginning of the Frisco, 1853. They started building track there. Well, of course, the Civil War stopped all the construction because they didn't have any money and they didn't have any people to build it. So everything kind of held up until 1868. Well, meanwhile, the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was formed right after the war, 1866, and they were going to build from Springfield, Missouri, to the Pacific Ocean. And so that's where the name Pacific came from. And it actually, unlike some railroads, they were actually intended to go to the Pacific. Many of them, like the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific, they kind of threw a Pacific on there to sell stock, I think. But the Rock Island did intend to go to the Pacific, and the Missouri Pacific actually sort of did go because they were part of the Gould Empire, which had the Denver Rio Grande and Western and the Missouri Pacific. But that all fell apart too, because a lot of these empires, as we talked about, they get overextended, and but anyway, the Atlantic and Pacific had a land grant going all the way across Indian Territory, and that became Oklahoma. And then it went to Amarillo, and then Albuquerque, and then on west to Flagstaff, and then to Barstow. Well, if that sounds familiar, that what became the route of the Santa Fe. And so sure enough, the Frisco merged with the Atlantic and Pacific in 1870, and then in 1890 the Frisco was sold to the Santa Fe. So now the Santa Fe had that route across northern New Mexico and northern Arizona.
Okay.
And so in 1900, by then the Frisco controlled the Chicago and Eastern Illinois. So here's the Frisco in this area. And then they had the Gulf Coast lines in Texas. This went from Brownsville, Corpus Christi to Houston, all the way to New Orleans. And that later became part of the Missouri Pacific. But at that time, it was a pretty good sized railroad. And it was became part of the Yoakum Empire. This is another one of those empires. Yoakum was a guy who tried to build this huge monster railroad in the United States. And the whole, of course, because they overextend, the financing collapsed. And so then the whole thing went into bankruptcy. And so out of the bankruptcy, the Frisco kind of came out sort of as it went in. It didn't have the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, or didn't have these Gulf Coast lines. So it was kind of back to the X from Springfield to Birmingham, and from St. Louis down to Fort Worth. And so then they started adding, because they were starting to get their feet on the ground again, and they guaranteed the bonds of the Quanah, Acme, and Pacific. Now there's a railroad, I don't know if they were going to go to the Pacific, but they didn't get too far, because they went from here in Oklahoma to Floydada, Texas. That was it. And you can see that this is a picture in the earlier part of the 1900s. You can see the Quanah, Acme, and Pacific is sort of a Frisco-like logo, and the locomotives are to Frisco standards. Eventually, it was merged, and it's still in existence. The Frisco was known for keeping their locomotives in superb condition, immaculate. And this is actually a decapod that was restored, but it's in excellent condition. That's the way they looked when they were running. The biggest locomotives they had were the 2000 class 2882 articulators, and here's the air tank up here. So they were planning on running big trains with that thing. But obviously, a locomotive like this can pull a lot, but not very fast. Because here's the firebox is pretty small, so you just can't convert that much coal into heat. But they were used because they have some hill and dale lines in Missouri and Arkansas and Oklahoma, so they needed pushers on some of the lines. Now then, in the 1930s, excuse me, the railroad got into streamlining. And the Americans loved streamlining. Everything had to be streamlined. So the big railroads like the New York Central and the Pennsylvania, they hired people like Louis Dreyfus and Raymond Loewy and people like that to design their engines. This was Louis Dreyfus designed this thing. It's for the New York Central for the 20th Century Limited and some of their other railroads. And what Louis Dreyfus did, which was really smart, he didn't hide because the Pennsylvania had a Broadway limited engine where all this stuff was hidden. Well, Louis Dreyfus says, no, he must have talked to the maintenance guys. The maintenance guy said, we got to get at this stuff. We've got to lubricate it, you know. And so he said, rather than hiding it, he says, let's celebrate it. So he had these new Bach-Pox drivers instead of the spoke drivers. And they were painted like very light color. And then he had chrome plated rods and nickel plated cylinder heads and everything. So he embraced it. And these were extremely successful engines. This is a plain old New York Central J Hudson, but they streamlined it, and these lasted quite a while. Now, a lot of the smaller railroads, they didn't have the money to hire Louis Dreyfus or Raymond Loy, so they'd find some guy in the shop that was creative, and they'd so here's a Frisco Pacific, and they put some lagging and sheet metal on it for their passenger trains. It doesn't look too bad. Some of them were pretty horrendous that the railroads came up with, but that one isn't too bad. It's kind of a very dark blue with sort of a cream color.